Should we get a few minutes then? When do you want to start?
I think some of the committee members should be coming in a bit late. So but I think there's people watching online. So
Okay.
I think we should just get started already. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the camera's right here.
Right.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks so much.
So, good evening, everybody, both here and online. It's nice to be here at the Energy Society. So, my name is Nick Eyre. I work in this building. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at the university. And what I'm going to be talking about is the work of the research centre that I have run since 2018, which you can see there. It's called CREDS, the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. Yeah, you don't want me to wander out.
Sorry.
Right.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right. It's just a habit of a lifetime is to wander around. What I'm really going to be talking about is the key findings from CREDS at quite a high level, and so I'll try and do it reasonably quickly and happy to discuss in more detail any questions that people have got at the end. But if anything isn't clear as I go through, do shout out, because I would like it to be clear as we go through. So just initially a little bit about CREDS. It's a centre funded by UK Research and Innovation, the Research Councils. We began in April 2018 and we will end in December 2023 with a budget of £19.5 million, which is quite big, even spread over five and a bit years. We're a distributed centre. The word centre means anything but centre, usually, in UK Research and Innovation. So we're spread over more than 20 universities, led by me here in Oxford with a support team here. And we act as the hub for energy demand research in the UK, which means that we try and communicate with a range of people who are not directly involved in CREDS, but also doing research in the field to try and create a research community in the area, and that's quite a common mode of organisation in UK research now. This slide sets out what we said the aims of CREDS would be at the beginning. They're still our aims. Two of them are really pretty common for a big research centre to deliver internationally leading research, in our case focusing on energy demand, and to secure impact for research in businesses and in policy making. In our cases, we added a third to champion the importance of energy demand as part of the transition strategy to an affordable low-carbon energy system. If we've written it a few, affordable zero-carbon energy system. So that's really the only substantial change in our aims. And the reason we put that in was that most people, when they hear energy transition, think about energy supply. They don't think about energy use, and we wanted to make the point that both are important. So our research programme is split into 9 themes. 3 of them are 3 main areas of energy use in the UK economy: energy in buildings, transport, and industry. There's 3 cross-cutting themes on flexibility, digital society, and policy and governance. Hope it's reasonably obvious why all those are important to the way energy is used. And then 3 challenges we've added as we have gone along on decarbonisation of heat, fuel and transport quality, and decarbonisation of steel. So we are just in the process of working out what we've done. And that's a frightening number to me, I mean, I'm probably the only person in the whole universe who will ever read all those 400. But I have read all our 400 publications, of which 240 are refereed journal articles. So that's sort of what is expected of high quality researchers. And we've had more than 800 engagement activities with other researchers, with policymakers, with business to explain all that. And in a way, that's quite impressive. I mean, I'm quite proud of it. But it did leave us asking, well, actually, so what? Apart from other energy researchers and people involved in detail in the field, how many people read refereed journal articles? How many of you think you might have read one of these 240 journal articles? Probably none of you. Maybe one. Okay, yeah. And if we want to impact, we thought, well, we actually need to do something about that. And we need to write things that are shorter, that synthesize our results. And of course, that sounds easy to do. There's a famous quote which is sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill and sometimes to other people, which goes along the lines of, I wrote a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short letter. And that sounds silly, but actually, I think we all sort of have a sense that it's true, that doing something that really conveys something briefly is more difficult. So that's what we've been trying to do in the past few months. Largely me been doing it, and what we've tried to do is synthesize our overall findings into these 15 areas. Before you panic, I'm not going to talk about all 15 of them tonight. I'm going to talk about the 7 that are marked there in green, and I'm going to be honest. This is you are the guinea pigs. This is the first time I've ever given this talk, and what it's based on is each of these 15 areas will be one page of our website next week. So we're going to change our website away from this is what we've done to this is what we've found, which is a very different way of presenting it in these 15 areas. And what you'll be able to do on each of those web pages will have links to the refereed journal articles. So you're sort of to the point that the aim is to make everybody 2 clicks away from the most detailed information, but actually to have information at the top. So that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about in these 7 areas. And of course, what we've tried to do is pick out some of the more interesting conclusions. Some of them you may think are fairly obvious, but we've supported them by evidence. Some of them I think are far from obvious. Indeed, might be considered to be controversial. So the first area is it's an obvious question. What's the potential for reducing energy use? We've looked at the UK and concluded actually that reducing demand will be a central part of delivering net zero. You wouldn't necessarily know that from reading the media, actually. And interestingly, we went off and talked to the Committee on Climate Change as we were setting out on doing this, and said to them, well, in your central scenario for reaching net zero, how much does energy demand change? And they said, well, we don't know. We've never done the sums that way. It seemed to me rather odd, because if you're going to reduce emissions from energy, you either have to reduce the amount of energy or you have to reduce the carbon in the energy. I mean, the two multiplied to give you the answer. So that's precisely what we've done, is go through reasonable ways of reducing energy. I'll say a bit more about those in a bit. And we've concluded that energy use could be halved in the UK by 2050, and that would mean our average power use is 1.3 kilowatts per person. That's below the current global average. Now that, I think, is a surprising. That surprised me as a conclusion. It means that you can have a good Western European type lifestyle with energy that is lower than the current global average, which I think implies that we could reach the whole world whilst delivering Sustainable Development Goals and decent living standards for everybody. And we've got the evidence in quite detailed models to back that up. The diagram on the right is just the outcome of 4 different scenarios that we ran. The right-hand 3 are compliant with zero carbon, net zero carbon in 2050 in the UK. The left-hand one is very business as usual. And so, yeah, we found 3 scenarios that are compliant with net zero. They reduce energy demand by about 34%, 40%, 50%. So our halving is the top, but if that's sort of what you do if you try hard to improve energy efficiency and reduce demand. That didn't particularly surprise me, some of those numbers, because we know that energy is the largest role in reducing UK emissions over the last 30 years. It's played a bigger role than the nuclear programme, the Dash for Gas, and the renewables programme put together. So that's another of our somewhat surprising findings. Not surprising to me, because I wrote the paper and did the work, but actually to many people will be surprised by that as a finding. A lot of that was in the 20 years of the first 20 years of the last 30, if you see what I mean. Public policies have weakened quite a lot in the last decade, and so the scope for doing a lot better than we've been doing in recent years. But energy demand can be reduced significantly in all of transport, buildings and industry. So those numbers are across all the sectors put together. In fact, the most scope is in transport, followed by buildings and then industry. The scale of the challenge of net zero, though, means we need to look beyond what you might think of as energy efficiency measures. If I could say energy efficiency, what sort of measures do you think about? You probably think about more efficient cars, but probably mostly about insulation. Actually, that's the one that pops up to most people. But actually, we need to do that. We need to insulate buildings like this one a lot better than it is at the moment. But we also need to think about, why do we use energy in the first place? What do we actually use it for? So you would have seen at the start, we called our themes things like transport and mobility, or materials and products, rather than just industry. So we're actually thinking about the more fundamental issues of how energy is used. And so these bigger demand reductions, 50%, are what you might call ordinary energy efficiency, but also things that you might think of as energy efficiency, but you might not. So things like, say, using public transport rather than cars, or recycling energy intensive materials. I mean, those things obviously contribute to energy efficiency in the big picture, but not necessarily would be thought of that. And some other trends can also contribute to this. Digitalisation is probably the most obvious. Digitalisation digital society isn't automatically a low energy society. There's lots of ways of, we could send cat visit videos to each other in even more bigger and bigger numbers and waste more and more energy. But there are ways you can use digitalisation to say enable car sharing in various ways through various platforms to demand reduction. So we looked at this rather broader picture. So the second area I want to talk about is energy systems. So our argument is that the way we use energy is strongly influenced by the wider energy system and vice versa. So we drew this diagram which shows that we deliberately wrote the demand stuff in big writing and with red rings around it, and energy supply is small, but that's just sort of our bias, really. And our argument was that if we're to have a sustainable energy supply system, probably based around renewables, we're going to need to do that changing of energy using activities that I talked about. We're going to need to improve energy efficiency. We're going to need to flex energy demand in time to balance renewable supplies, and we're going to need to do fuel switching. Obviously, we can't go on burning gas in buildings and burning petrol in engines. So all those things need to be done on the demand side to get us to a sustainable system. And that's because future supply is going to be dominated by variable renewable electricity, hence the flexing, but it's also electricity. So most of the renewables, certainly most of the ones that will be used in the UK, produce electricity. And obviously you can have a system where your electricity supply, your energy supply system is largely electricity, and your energy demand system is largely using oil and gas. It just doesn't add up. So we are going to have to do a lot of electrification, particularly of transport and buildings, particularly heating in buildings. And that is a big part of these demand reductions, because in round numbers, an electric vehicle is 3 times as efficient as a petrol vehicle, and a heat pump is 3 times as efficient as a boiler, maybe 4, those sorts of numbers. So a big bit of this energy efficiency is wrapped up with electrification. Indeed, one of our more surprising conclusions is that insulation is now going to be the smaller player in demand reduction in buildings. The bigger player is going to be electrification. Right? So that really winds up the insulation industry when we say that, but that's good. It's good to try and encourage different ways of thinking. So heat is largely going to have to come from heat pumps, and that raises a whole range of questions. We produce a lot of papers on heat pumps, largely looking at some of the more detailed problems about using them, and there are problems across all those different categories there. Going to be a lot more used, a lot more in many areas of energy use, but we don't know that everywhere. So there are some areas of the energy economy, like steelmaking, heavy goods vehicles, aviation, where I think the jury is still out on what decarbonisation is going to look like. Electricity, I think, will play a role in all of those. I think we will see electric planes. We'll certainly see more electric steelmaking, probably electric HGVs, but hydrogen might also have a big role in all those areas. And when we look at this question of flexibility in energy demand in time, we've done some systems modelling to look at what the implications of that. The most surprising finding is the amount of storage that you need in an economy like the UK. And it's principally driven by 2 factors. One is the intermittency of wind, which we expect to be the biggest supplier of energy in the UK. And unlike solar, which tends to be fairly regular, it's sunny during the day, it's not sunny at night. Wind goes on and off more on a sort of weekly basis, and it's whilst it's easy to predict, you can get very non-windy weeks. And of course, we use a lot more energy in winter than in summer, and even with climate change, that will go on being the case for, well, if it ever stops being the case in the UK, we've got disastrous climate change. The amount of storage we need is in the tens of terawatt hours. That's for those of you who are not familiar with the terawatt hour, the UK uses about 1,500, 1,600 terawatt hours. So we're talking about a week or two's worth of energy storage. That's an order of magnitude bigger than we will be able to get from batteries. It would just be too expensive. So we're talking about thermal storage and/or hydrogen storage. Yeah. And how that links to energy demand, I think that's you're going to need quite a lot more work in future. I'll say a bit about energy security later when I talk about the crisis, but I mean, it's sort of obvious to everybody except our previous Prime Minister, I think, that reduced energy demand and increased flexibility can play an important role in improving energy security. So there are a range of issues where we're coming at it from a demand perspective, but you actually need to think about the whole system. Peak there should be blindingly obvious, but you could read a lot of stuff about energy and never see it written down in that exact way. And people, when people enter the debate about energy, they usually enter it as users. And our point is that, well, actually, yeah, that is important, but people also have votes, and many people work in activities that are related to energy. I'm one of them, of course. Two of the crucial transitions that I've mentioned already, heat pumps and electric vehicles, are going to clearly depend on shifts in consumer purchasing. Right, that's fairly obvious. It's millions of individual purchase decisions. So the capital investment depends on people, but actually the operational use also depends on people, particularly in buildings. Buildings are operated by non-experts, often with quite clunky control systems. And so if we're going to change the ways that energy is used, we are going to need to do better in providing people with information and advice, particularly for vulnerable people, and actually particularly as the technologies we use get more complex. Particularly in heating. I think our key surprising finding in this area is that just relying on consumer behaviour to lead this change is not going to work. It hasn't worked anywhere else in the world that's further down the route on these technologies, and it hasn't worked in previous transitions in the UK, say the transition away from inefficient boilers to efficient boilers, or the huge transformations we've seen in lighting systems. They've been driven by public policy and the supply chain. So engaging people in the energy debate is not an alternative to investing in infrastructure and getting better regulation and stronger incentives. Indeed, I would argue it's sort of almost the other way around. The only way you're going to be able to get this sort of engagement that we need is by changing the infrastructure, regulating better, and having stronger incentives. Having said that, if we're going to get the sort of towards the top end of the savings that I set out towards 50%, doing things like much better use of energy intensive materials through a circular economy, much more use of public transport, far more cycling, sorts of things involve changes to social norms. So it's not just an individual consumer decision, it's about the way society thinks about these things, about, do we make public transport cheap? Do we make cycling safe? Those sorts of questions depend on much wider public attitudes. So we think people have got a role as citizens, and actually our experience of citizens' assemblies which have been run in the UK, there was both a big national citizens' assembly on climate change, and there was one here in Oxford, both of which I was involved with, and other colleagues were involved too. And I was frankly surprised by how positive, optimistic and creative people were in those processes. Almost like once you give people the challenge of, look, you said you're concerned about climate change, so what are we going to do about it? Not what is somebody else going to do about it, but what we're all going to do about it. So that you change the discussion from how are you going to respond to a new law, or how are you going to respond if there's a carbon tax, or how are you going to to, well, how do we all, what's the best way of doing these things? How, in Oxford, for example, how are we going to get to net zero by 2040, which is the aim that people, when consulted, wanted to go for. There are also huge implications in terms of jobs. Many of you will know there's a sort of a discourse now around the just transition seems to mean quite different things to different people. If you're in Aberdeen, it means what on earth are people who are currently employed in the oil industry going to do? If you're in sub-Saharan Africa, it means how are we going to improve living standards at the same time as addressing climate change? How are we going to give people access to electricity, for example? I think in this country, a lot of it will be around the new jobs that need to emerge, and particularly the new skills that we'll need, most obviously in the construction sector, where we need to really change not just obvious things like changing heating engineers into air conditioning engineers, essentially, or heat pump engineers, but also how to get people to understand and work on buildings in a way which sees them as whole systems. So a lot of work that my colleagues have done in that sort of area. Just sort of emphasising the point that engaging people isn't just about what we all do in our own homes. It's got this much broader dimension to it of what we're going to do as well. So one of the areas that is increasingly being thought about is what are all the benefits of improving energy efficiency. And traditionally we've thought about, well, it saves money on bills and it reduces carbon emissions. And a lot of the public policy analysis is done on that basis. But actually there's more and more work looking at wider benefits. The diagram on the right-hand side is taken directly from the International Energy Agency, who are increasingly stressing these issues. So energy security, green jobs, more comfortable homes, air pollution, diets, more active lifestyles. You can see that all these things are linked to energy efficiency improvements, and actually in some cases might be the main driver for doing work on energy efficiency rather than climate change being necessarily the driver. Health is a particularly big issue. Both reducing car use and electrifying transport in particular will help to reduce air pollution, which is a big issue in most cities. It's a particularly big issue in the developing megacities in the global south. So there's a huge amount that can be done there. Both clean transport and low carbon diets improve health across the population. One of my colleagues, Christian Brand, in this building, done a lot of work on that area in clean transport. And we know that energy efficient buildings reduce the risk of cold homes and ill health. Though you need to take care about ventilation issues. Usually tens of thousands of people more die in winter than in summer in this country. That's partly the reasons for that are complex, but a lot of it is to do with homes that are colder than is desirable, particularly for vulnerable people. And then, of course, energy efficiency investment has got a very high propensity to create jobs, but also actually to create jobs quite locally, whereas energy supply investment might be great at creating jobs in PV panel production in China or in oil exploration in Qatar. Yeah, actually, if you're insulating a building, most of the jobs are going to be created in where you are, which should be quite attractive to governments. About digitalisation, yes, it can improve energy efficiency, but also it's the major driver of economic growth at the same time. So a lot of benefits that we are not often factored into thinking about energy efficiency. I've sort of touched on equity and justice issues as well, but this is a growing area of work, and I think the easiest way to think of it for me is that there are major inequalities in the energy services that people get largely as a function of income. That's very obvious if you think internationally, where we've got 1 billion people without access to electricity, 3 billion without access to clean cooking still. But it's also true within most countries, and the UK is no exception. Use more energy, not surprisingly. Lower income households spend a much higher share of their income on household energy. So 10, 20%, maybe 30%, 40% for some households this winter. Very, very high numbers, which of course other households don't. So there are these poverty and transport poverty, which colleagues have done a lot of work on, and they obviously overlap because they're related to income, but there's not a complete overlap. So you might get more transport poverty for people in rural areas who are a long way from services and need a car because there's very poor public transport in a way that you don't get in London, but you might have some really terrible housing quality in parts of London, which means you get fuel poverty. So understanding those is a lot of what we've been trying to do. The affordability crisis mainly affects lower income households, and I'll say a bit more about that later. I think what all that means, and what we're beginning to see, is that energy policy is being slightly reframed to think about these things. If you said 2 years ago that a British government, British Conservative government, that is going to subsidise energy costs of individual households by 20-30%, whatever they're doing, no one would have believed you. But actually, that is exactly what's happening, and it's happening really because of equity concerns. If you look at transport, it's a very different picture. Actually, high-income households spend a higher proportion of their income on transport in many cases than low-income households do. It's for long-distance travel, and it's even more particularly the case for aviation. I mean, globally, 1% of the population does 50% of the flying. It's hugely inequitably distributed. We also need to think about equity when we're designing policy incentives. It's very easy to say, well, yeah, we're going to need incentives for electric vehicles. I think both of those are true. But we need to recognise at the same time that the people who get the benefits of those in the first instance are likely to be people in higher income groups, because those are the natural early movers in those sorts of markets. And actually, the same is true in providing demand response, in varying in responding to time of use tariffs to change the time that you use electricity. For everybody, for many people, they have to cook when they have to cook. They have to give the kids a bath when they give the kids a bath. Their lives are constrained in ways that different, very differently for different people. Particularly people who are retired often have much more flexibility. So we've done quite a lot of work to understand that, who will win and lose from time of use tariffs. I've got about 4 more slides, I think. I'm going to first talk about governance and policy in general, and then the crisis that we're in particular. I mean, everything that we've done implies and shows that UK government policy needs strengthening to drive change to improve energy efficiency, particularly in the built environment, transport, but also in circular, to create circular economy and materials as well. We think it's not just a policy problem, it's an institutional problem, and particularly many of the areas that need attention are areas where local authorities, local government might be a better place to do things than national government. So governance reform to give more powers to local authorities to drive building improvement we would see as being part of the agenda. As I said at the beginning, really, energy supply continues to be central in debates about energy, and that affects government. And so even when the benefits of energy demand reduction would be larger than new energy supply, we tend to get government defaulting back to energy supply. That's been particularly obvious under the Johnson and Truss administrations. I'm hoping it's going to get a little bit better now, but we'll wait and see. We know what works to deliver energy efficiency. We need packages of policies that combine regulation, incentives, and information programs. So a lot of this is not rocket science. It's been done before and done in other places. I think there will have to be a greater emphasis on public engagement for some of the more radical steps that might be needed and the long term, just so people understand the context of the policies that are being made. At a sectoral level, I mean, a lot of policies need to be sectoral. It's not the same policies in transport and buildings and industry. We clearly need a strong focus on electric vehicles, and the UK government has a good and strong focus on electric vehicles. I would say that. But it's still got a big road building programme. It's still got bus services in much of the country, and money is still being pumped into essentially subsidising aviation and building airports in ways that really aren't consistent with the forward projections for what's needed. In buildings, I think the key problem is going to be around supply chains and skills. I think that we sort of know what needs to be done to buildings in terms of improving their fabric and decarbonising the heating systems, but getting trained and increased and expanded support, trained people on expanded supply chains to deliver that is going to be a long step. Incentives, regulation, enforcement, all going to be important. In industry is the one area where traditional end-use energy efficiency measures are we've probably done a lot of what can be done. You know, if you run a steel furnace, you run it pretty efficiently, but of course it's a big fraction of the cost. So what we need in those areas is really more thinking about materials efficiency improvement. Why do we need as much new steel, aluminium, cement as we actually currently use? And we probably don't need that if we recycle materials properly. And then longer term, new process, how do we make steel, cement, etc. in ways that have zero carbon? And we've got some work on that, particularly in steel making, which I'll be happy to talk about. So let me just end where I ended talking a bit about energy demand in the energy crisis. Clearly, when we set up CREDS in 2018, we didn't have a stream of work called the affordability crisis, because there wasn't one. Along, so some of the things we can say are fairly obvious, but that's the path that gas and electricity prices have taken in the last year. So you can see electricity prices gone up about 60%, gas prices way more than doubled, and that's even with the government's energy cap in place. If the government hadn't capped those numbers, then we'd be seeing the electricity number off the top and gas 3 times more expensive than it was a year ago. So the government has focused on limiting prices, and I completely understand why. That means it really hasn't put enough attention into improving energy efficiency or actually targeting the financial support on the low-income households who need it most. I think that was difficult. I mean, it was a policy challenge for government because they had to do something quickly. But I think they will need to reframe the way they're essentially subsidising general consumption into more effective ways of supporting particularly the households who need it most, and thinking about how to improve energy efficiency. I mean, the big plus of the government's policy at the moment is that, from an energy efficiency point of view, is that any money they now decide to put into energy efficiency doesn't just save end users money, it saves the Treasury money. So that will get more attention in the next year for that reason. And we think saving energy should also be part of any energy security strategy. Clearly, there are concerns about UK energy security this winter, particularly whether the gas will for gas-fired power stations and indeed for other things. Now that's not the same thing as the affordability crisis, but it's obviously linked to it in its causes, particularly in the Ukraine. And reducing energy use fairly obviously can help address both of those. The challenge is that, as I've said, reducing energy use in buildings is a long-term agenda, right? It's going to need skills, it's going to need capital investment. We may get to a point in a month's time, 2 months' time, 3 months' time, I don't know, where we have to reduce energy demand very, very quickly. And actually there is quite a lot of experience of that. There's experience in Japan, post-Fukushima, there's experience in other countries that have had particular energy crises. And the one thing we know is that high-income households have the most scope to reduce energy use quickly because they're more waste. And particularly, the one measure that the government could suggest, and probably only would be to reduce thermostat temperatures to 19. Any lower than that, you begin to risk the health of vulnerable people, but we think that reducing thermostat temperatures by that amount would save many tens of terawatt hours. It would save a substantial fraction of but that's a political challenge that would require an energy minister or perhaps a prime minister to appear on television and say this is what we're doing. Can be done though. It was done in the pandemic. If it's important, then that sort of political leadership can emerge. But really, the crises, in a way, I think for climate are a good thing in the long term because it does focus our attention on where does our energy come from and how we can produce more renewable energy locally, and on these key questions about how to reduce energy demand. I'll stop there and talk about you will get that and talk about this agenda for several hours if I have to. But let's end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or your thoughts actually.
Thank you. Well, my name is Daniel. I'm student of Master of Public Policy.
Right.
And before coming here to Oxford, I was Director General of the Energy Agency at local level in Mexico. One of the main indicators we use sometimes is the energy consumption as an indicator of development and well-being.
Yes, very bad one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now I see you're like saying we need to reduce our consumption.
Yeah.
But I think for some developing countries, it makes no sense because we still have, for example, in the country we have like 2 million people. The country is like 120 million people.
Yeah.
130. We still have 2 million people. They don't have access to electricity.
Right. Yeah.
For example, and we don't have these heating issues because it's a tropical country, basically.
Yeah.
And of course, I understand we need to move toward a electrification of the mobility, but at the same time, the country have not developed a generation or an energy matrix based on clean energy, clean sources. So we're just moving the problem from one point to other one. We are stopped burning the fossil fuels within the cars to burn in the central generations. I think. So what could be a middle point for these developing countries when we understand that at the same time, generally speaking, not only electricity, but also other sources like natural gas, is an indicator of development and economic growth and richness, generally speaking.
I mean, you all know that the literature indicates there's a poor, that energy demand per capita is not a great indicator of development.
This is the first time I hear it, honestly.
Okay, right. Well, so the USA, if you look at that indicator for the USA, it's double that for Western Europe. Do you really think Americans are twice as well off as Western Europeans? I don't think that. If you look at that, say, the healthcare system, you wouldn't reach that conclusion, would you? And you get those sorts of variations across, even within Europe. I think what I'm talking about here, though, is change over time. And as I said, there are some. So the UK has been reducing its energy demand for about 15 years. And until recently, we weren't getting worse off. We are getting worse off now. But and that was, but essentially because the rate of energy efficiency improvement exceeded the rate of growth of demand for energy services, and that's because in a country like this, most of the basic services have been achieved. So if people are using more energy in their homes, they're using it on a fourth television, or
They're on top of the
right. So as you reach that, then the growth in demand for energy services levels off, and if you improve your energy, that's why I think it's 15 countries. The IPCC reported on this. I think 15 countries have consistently reduced their energy demand over the last 15 years. They're all OECD countries, absolutely, yeah. And that's the reason I pointed to this figure, this 1.3 kilowatts per person, which is about what, where you multiply by 8,760 to get it into kilowatt hours per person per year, which is about what, 1,200 or something, 1,100, 1,200. I mean, it's half the current number. I would guess Mexico's probably around about that level.
Yeah.
At a guess. And so what we're saying is that we think Mexico could, if you can achieve the sorts of transitions you're talking about, electrification of transportation linked to a change in the electricity supply system, more efficient industry, better buildings, designing buildings so they don't need as much cooling, because it's going to be a cooling challenge in Mexico, not a heating challenge. So those are the sorts of changes, but you need to do this work needs to be done country by country.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say Mexico should do this, but I would be very surprised if Mexico needed to increase its overall energy use very much in order to reach OECD standards of living. That means having cities that look more like European cities than the ones just over the border. The most wasteful city I've ever been to in my life is Dallas-Fort Worth. I didn't see a single person riding a bike. You had to drive everywhere, even if it was to the superstore just over the road. The buildings were all enormous. They were all overcooled. There are choices to be made, right? It's that simple. Yeah. I'm very aware, from having worked on IPCC reports, that it's not helpful for people in the global north to lecture people in the global south, because it's us that's wasting most of the energy at the moment, right? Yeah. So that's leadership is needed there too. I pointed to the USA because that's a particularly bad case, but some of the Middle Eastern countries now, that the rich ones, Qatar, Kuwait, those sorts of countries, incredibly wasteful as well. Australia, pretty bad. Western European, better, but as I say, we think we can go to half the energy use we currently have and still have better lives, right? Now, that involves more people cycling to work, maybe, but I don't consider my life, I'm very deprived because I cycle to work. I actually think I have a better life than the people who I overtake on the Iffley Road every morning sitting in the traffic jam. Right? how do we? Yeah, but it needs detailed work in every country. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my point, because I for example, we still need to increase the industry.
Yes. Yes.
It
Exactly.
has energy at some point.
Yes.
Almost 50% of the country is in the informal economy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you need to bring them on the table, and their activities, by natural assumption, will demand more energy.
Yeah.
If you would take the people that is on the streets working and you take them into a office, into a building, etc., it's going to take more energy at the end of the day. So I think
to you reach a certain point, but we're actually, I think, we've seen this trend in China as it industrialised. China is obviously the most obvious case of a country that's been through this process. Energy demand in China is now stabilising because there's more building service economy. Many of the basic needs in the cities, at least, have been satisfied. So I think we are seeing the trend that has gone through the OECD countries will go into China and maybe the other Southeast Asian countries, and then maybe Latin America, and as development grows, Africa looks like it will be last, South Asia and Africa. But that's why I say it's a leadership challenge for the global north at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It felt like most of your messages come from CREDS is sort of aimed at maybe policymakers and maybe the fellows who are academic.
Yeah.
Have you had much engagement coming from like companies or from the finance community, and if you haven't, are you intending to kind of try and?
Yeah, I think we've not been as effective in dealing with businesses as policymakers, and I think that's partly because businesses are such a mixed group. There are 3 million SMEs. It's very, very difficult. Often run by one person. It's really very difficult to communicate with them, and they probably aren't the key players anyway. They're more like households and their energy using. So our main targets, you found here on one, finance sector. The energy sector itself, energy retailers have energy efficiency obligations, and getting them to understand this, and increasingly they do, and are very positive, particularly about the electrification agenda. Well, the electricity companies gas companies are not all positive about it, so there's always exceptions. And the heavy industrial companies are very interested in, say, the bits of our work on green steel making. So it's a case of not trying to target everybody. It's a case of it's a sort of marketing challenge for us, really, is to identify who will be interested in what we've got to say in particular areas. So there's a lot more work to do for sure, but the number of companies who've got a sort of total systems perspective is very, very small. There's some, maybe the Amazons and Googles have, and they of course are doing a lot of work in this area. Apart from that, National Grid. So we do talk to National Grid. We help inform their future scenarios, which is but not many other companies have got that sort of total national perspective, which is sort of where most of our key messages are focused.
We have pizza and everyone's welcome to speak. Valeria, ask you questions.
What is that? Plenty of pizza.
Go and help yourselves to pizza. Come on, don't be shy. Any other questions or thoughts or?
I was wondering what your opinions were on HS and train line being built and stuff. It seems quite controversial in public transport.
Yeah, it does, and I'm not myself a transport specialist. My colleagues who work on transport are generally pretty negative about HS2. My opinion is perhaps coloured by being from Leeds originally. So one of the places that might benefit from HS2, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence that the first stage of it, say London to Birmingham, the main effect would be to obviously the direct effect is to allow people to travel from Birmingham to London and vice versa more quickly. The secondary effect is probably more people commuting from Birmingham to London. Yeah, and so it's those sorts of. But that depends on economic development policies in different places, and it depends on land use policies and where people live with respect to stations. I think most of our evidence would point to in urban areas the need to promote within urban area good public transport and active travel, cycling, and walking. Actually, walking is the thing that has grown the most during the pandemic and seems to be not going back to where it was. More people are walking to work than did before the pandemic. There you go. So, and we didn't expect that. We expected more people to be cycling to work, and they're not. More people walking to work. We don't know why yet. But the main challenge in transport is really long distance transport, and it's how do we reduce it? How do we constrain its growth? Actually, aviation being the obvious case. I think it's 4% of the world's population has been on a plane. So when people say, "Well, I only travel by plane 3 or 4 times a year," that's 3 or 4 more times than most people on the planet will ever travel on a plane. So we need to sort of keep those. That's not to say no one should ever travel by plane. I do travel by plane. It's like IPCC meetings on a plane. It always feels a very odd thing to do. And in the long term, I think there will be ways of decarbonising transport, although still some of the stratospheric emissions are going to have a climate effect. But at the moment, we tax every other sort of transport fuel by aviation fuel, which is I understand why that is. It's to do with international agreements, but it's a fairly crazy state of affairs to take the most damaging form of transport you can think of and essentially subsidise it. That's what we do. So we can do a lot better on aviation. People are looking at policies like frequent flyer levies. So you could take 1 trip a year by plane without getting a tax, but you take 2, you get tax. You take 3, you get an even bigger tax. You take 4, you take 50, you go once a week. Some people fly once a week, then you end up paying pretty heavy tax bill at the end of the year. That seems to me the sorts of policy that could be both effective and popular. Well, not popular with the people who are flying 50 times a year, but popular with everybody else. So there's some sort of thinking about how to do that, and of course, moves to electrify short-range aviation, which is something we wouldn't have thought of as possible even a decade ago.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question. What do you think about electrification, transportation system and the building system, how it helps with the energy demand reduction? I was thinking about maybe if we electrify transportation and building, it's not necessary to reduce the energy demand, or what kind of relationship between those?
Well, I'm saying it automatically will, simply because electric heating and electric vehicles are that much more efficient. What it means at the sort of urban area level, and I think this is the way I'm increasingly thinking about the challenge of decarbonising a city is, look at this city, uses quite a bit of electricity, but it uses more gas and quite a lot of petrol and diesel. And in 30 years' time, we want to have a system. We want to use no petrol, no diesel, and no gas. It's a big challenge. It means that most of the energy is going to have to come in through the electricity network. So the electricity demand is going to grow hugely, and I think this is often a source of confusion. People hear, "Oh, we're going to need much more electricity." Yes, we are, but that's because we're using electricity to substitute for other things. It means you've got other problems like what do you do with the gas network? Redundant, or do you put hydrogen in it for some uses? And it's a big challenge for the electricity network companies because their networks were not designed to take electricity for heating to every building or electricity for charging. There's a lot of interesting work in Oxford on that, which you will know about through your supervisor. But it's a big challenge and not really been thought through. I don't think that the sense that we're moving to perhaps an all electric economy or pretty close to that in many urban areas over a relatively short period of time by energy standards. We tend to, energy systems tend to change fairly slowly. So when I hear stories of zero carbon by 2030, I just say, well, actually, no, you're not. These are big infrastructure changes that are needed, and we definitely need to plan for them. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Anyone else?
You mentioned citizens' assemblies, and I agree. I think it looks like they're useful and they're used. But how replicable do you think they are? Because they need sort of experts facilitation and an engaged community or something. And I don't know.
Well, the National Citizens' Assembly was as close as they could get to a random selection of the population. Of course, they had to agree to go to Birmingham for 2 weekends, so it's not completely, but it was and social class and gender and race to be a mixture of the UK population, and it looked and felt like that to me. What the questions people asked were very sensible and basic questions like, how does a heat pump work? How much will it cost me to run an electric vehicle? Where would I charge it if I don't have access to, if I don't have a driveway at home? There were really that sort of important, basic questions of people trying to get their heads around what the zero carbon transition looks like for them in their lives. So it's why I think this agenda is important, because people are not going to make decisions about big power stations. That's somebody else's job. But if we're talking about electrifying heating, electrifying transport, insulating buildings, recycling materials, that's all of our jobs. And so I don't think we do it without people understanding why they're doing it. So it's not just a information problem. It really is an education problem, I think, which is why people need to go through the arguments about climate change and be convinced that it's real and that it's important to do something about it and that we can do something about it and that it's not going to just that it can make their lives better. So that's what facilitation is tricky, because what counts as being neutral in these debates? It's the same challenge the BBC went through of, if I'm being neutral about climate change, the Committee on Climate Change, and then somebody who's a climate denier, because that's not balanced. That's just silly, really. On the other hand, you have to have a debate about the relative merits of, say, heat pumps and hydrogen, district heating, and because that's a real active debate. And don't think we get anywhere by pretending that that there's a complete consensus on how this needs to be done when there isn't. And that's what, and there are political choices to make. How much do you rely on regulation? How much do you rely on taxation? Those are genuine decisions that reasonable people can make different judgments on, depending on their broader social and political views, I think. But I think getting a shared understanding of roughly what it looks like is quite important. And what made me positive about from that experience of the citizen assemblies was that people were engaged in that discussion. Yeah, regular people who'd not thought about it before were capable of getting involved, asking sensible questions, and then expressing a view on key questions. Sort of how a democracy ought to work, really. I think doesn't usually. Is it pizza time? It's pizza time. Thanks, everybody.